Okay, understanding attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Good timing. It is the most common of all neurodevelopmental disorders, and we know from last week neurodevelopment means the development of the brain. It is a brain-based disorder. It is not a social disorder. You do not get ADHD from your parenting skills or from a teacher, from interactions. It is not a social disorder. It is a brain-based disorder. Within girls, it is predominantly genetic. Within boys, 70% of it is genetic. The other 30% is acquired. And by that, we mean we get it from the environment. This could be a bacterial infection. It could be something like leukemia. There are different causes to ADHD when we're talking about acquired ADHD. We also know it correlates highly with mother's genetics and is exacerbated if a mother smokes during pregnancy. So if you have a predisposition to ADHD and you smoke or drink alcohol, then that will make the ADHD worse. We know that it affects more boys than it does girls. And we know it is devastating when we get to adulthood ADHD. It is serious and it is not well understood. And of all the neurodevelopmental disorders, I think this is the one in the DSM 5.1 that is going to change the most, because we have got a lot more research, a lot more understanding of ADHD in the past 10 or so years. Now I say it's devastating, and that's because adulthood ADHD, although we're not talking about adults in this course particularly, I think it's important for you to know that these adults with ADHD will die younger than your typically developing adults, your normal adults. Risk-taking behaviours, and we'll come back to sex, drugs and rock and roll. They are also prone to suicide, bulimia, heart disease. Okay, I'm painting a pretty devastating picture. It can also be wonderful, and these children can go on to do some amazing things. So we will talk about the different array of ADHD and what it can do for us. Some adults with ADHD create and go on to do amazing things. I'm going to cry. Seriously. It's not that difficult. Come on. Right, let's see if that works. Now, Alma also runs another course called Attentional Control and Social Adaptation, where she goes through ADHD as well. So this is just the overview, quite a detailed overview, but an overview of what ADHD is. She will go into far more detail about how in Hong Kong we diagnose it with the SWAN and what happens within clinical psychs here far more than I will. Oh, this is going to be a disaster. Come on! There we go. Right. So an overview, we're going to look at definition, we're going to look at symptoms, clinical features, diagnoses, causes, comorbidities, and treatments. Now, as I said, it is the most common of all neurodevelopmental disorders. It is a brain-based disorder. And when we think about the brain, predominantly when we're talking about ADHD, we are talking about the prefrontal cortex. And this is 30% behind typically developing children. So if we're looking at teenagers, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, their capabilities are of a 9, 10, 11-year-old. So when you are in the classroom, if you are dealing with parents, you need to be aware of the brain deficits. Okay, they are working 30% behind. So if you're asking someone in your classroom to do a particular task that you would expect a 13-year-old to do, don't expect your 13-year-old with ADHD to be able to do it, because they won't. Okay, it is a brain-based disorder and they function 30% behind a typically developing child. Okay, so just some examples of what it feels like to have ADHD. And later on, if any of you have got experience of having ADHD, usually someone in the year group does have ADHD and they share their experiences, or experiences of having friends or family members with ADHD. We can talk about it in a group. But at the moment, the definition, the term ADHD is about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is the condition that makes it difficult for children to pay attention and control their behaviour. What we need to start thinking about is ADHD being a disorder of self-regulation, not being able to regulate your own behaviour. We need to think about ADHD as being a disorder of executive functioning. And by executive functioning, we mean cognitive control. We need to think about ADHD as being a disorder of time. Individuals with ADHD live in the here and now. There is no thought to the past. There is no thought to the future. It's a disorder of self-regulation. It is a disorder of cognitive control. And we'll come back to all of those definitions as we go through. We also know it's genetic. It's a disorder of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine is all about rewards. It's all about pleasures. It's a disorder of self-regulation. Yeah. And when we think about self-regulation and we think about a disorder of time, it's about a disorder of self-regulation towards a particular goal. Goal-directed behaviour. These children do not have it. They live in the here and now. They do not understand time, past or future, with regards to goal orientation. They can't manage themselves, their behaviour. They can't regulate their own behaviour towards a future goal. We'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. So the main symptoms of ADHD in the DSM-5 as it stands today are inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Now this may change because we know that an awful lot of children with ADHD also have conduct disorder. So it might be that we have the presentation of ADHD with and without conduct disorder, and we'll go into that in a minute. We also know that these are different depending on the type of presentation you get. There are 3 different types of ADHD presentations. We also know that they are different symptoms depending on the different age, and as we grow and develop, these symptoms change. Conduct disorder does not, it always stays. So the DSM and the amount of research that we have now, this is likely to change. So there is a global prevalence of ADHD between 6 and 7%. Within Hong Kong, we're at the lower end of about 6%, and in early adolescence, we're down to about 4%. Now, whether this is to do with awareness, whether this is to do with people actually wanting a diagnosis, that label, whether it's to do with money and funding, we don't know. Alma might be in a better position to know the absolute stats on that for Hong Kong. Myths. ADHD is caused by bad parenting. It is not. Bad parenting and social environment does not cause ADHD. Bad parenting can make ADHD worse, and we know that 50% of children with ADHD have a parent with ADHD, but bad parenting does not cause ADHD. It is a brain-based disorder. Children with ADHD will eventually grow out of it. 50 to 60% of children with ADHD will go on to have it as an adult presentation of ADHD. Almost 60% will go on to have adult ADHD. ADHD is not a medical condition. It is a medical condition. We know it's to do with dopamine, the neurotransmitter, and we know that it is genetic. So those are the most common myths, and hopefully you'll leave today knowing that these are not accurate. Now, the history of ADHD goes back almost to the beginning of time. Symptoms of ADHD, of inattention, of abnormal motor control have been around for a very long time. When we first looked at the DSM-2, it was included as hyperkinetic impulse disorder. Kinetic meaning sort of a movement, a hypermovement impulse control. By the 1980s, the DSM-3 was looking at ADD, Attention Deficit Disorder, and interestingly, it was looking at it with hyperactivity and without hyperactivity. It separated it into those 2 different components. Now, of course, you'll see in a minute the different presentations of ADHD. Some had hyperactivity more than others. By the time we got to 1987, we threw everything into one big pot, and it didn't matter if you were inattentive or impulsive or hyperactive, you just got the one diagnosis, ADHD. Now we have different subtypes, and this hasn't actually changed from the DSM-4. The DSM-5 is still the same. There was no major changes in the DSM-5. We can have a combined presentation, so we have all three. So you will have inattentive, impulsivity and hyperactivity. You can have a presentation of predominantly inattentive, and you can have a presentation of predominantly hyperactive and impulsive, and we'll come back to that when we look at the DSM. Now, this predominantly inattentive may well change. With the more research that we're doing, we're almost finding that this inattentiveness is a disorder in its own right, and they call that sluggish cognitive tempo. It's a horrible word or collection, but predominantly inattentive is sluggish cognitive tempo. There's not enough research on it at the moment to get into the next DSM, but people are talking about it in the scientific world, which is why it might change. If we look here, it's a lovely little graph, timeline, dating right back to the beginning. And you can see the different colours here. When we get to sort of the 1980s, the 1990s, we're seeing ADHD in its presentation as we know it today, really. We're describing ADHD. We are seeing it in both boys and girls, although we know it's more in boys than it is in girls. We are looking at fMRIs and MRIs, and we can see inside the brain, although still we cannot, the areas of the brain and our neuro-imaging are not good enough for us to diagnose it through looking at MRI scans. We are refining all the time, and we are understanding far more about the comorbidities than ever before. We know that 80% of children with ADHD will go on to have a comorbidity, so we'll have another disorder as well, and of those 50% will have two or more. So it is massive. We know, coming on here, that it is a serious public health problem, that we need to do a lot more research in it, and that's up to you guys to go out and do some wonderful data collection and help with the validity and reliability of what we are finding. We also have a lot more drugs that have been developed, and we'll talk a lot about the stimulants and the non-stimulants and the way in which they activate the brain slightly differently. We know a lot more about the genes than we used to know, these polygenetics, that it comes from two different types, so from dads and mums. We know a lot more about how we can treat it, how we can help these individuals, the CBT, and now we know about the mindfulness, and we also know about behavioural therapy. And mostly, importantly, it's not just about medication, and it's not just about behavioural therapy, it's the combination that really helps the most. And we'll talk a lot about that at the end. So symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity and impulsivity. If you've seen children, you will understand what I am saying. Even from a very early age, we are seeing symptoms, and this is of inattentiveness. Self-regulation, cognitive control. Children will have a strong will from an early age, and we're seeing that development of oppositional defiant disorder. Unresponsive to discipline, again, this oppositional defiant disorder. Some of these children are having language difficulties at a very early age, and we know there's a high comorbidity with specific learning disorders. Again, structured play, difficulty following instructions, holding information, and we'll talk a lot about working memory. Toilet training problems, motor skills. the failure to persist towards that future goal. Time disorder. Now when we get on to adolescent inattentiveness, shifting from one task to another, doing one bit of homework and another bit of homework, playing a game, playing another game, totally disorganised, not remembering where you put anything, not knowing what comes next. And this leads to serious academic problems, ongoing underachievement because they know it. This is not an intellectual disability. They're not stupid by any stretch of the imagination. They have the knowledge, but they just can't produce the work. They may appear lazy, disinterested, and again, we're looking here about mood disorders and behavioural problems, this oppositional defiant disorder. So if we're beginning to look at these symptoms, how many of you know about working memory? Think about the working memory disorder, that executive functioning. They can't keep in mind, they can't hook information whilst they deal with something else. Let's have a look. So if we have information coming in, this could be through our eyes, through our senses, and we get to our short-term memory. Now from there, we can go to our long-term memory. When we get to our working memory, we have information that we hear, that's my ear, and information that we see. Okay, and that's our phonological loop. Do you remember that from undergrad? That is our visual spatial sketchpad. Children who have ADHD have an issue with integrating this information. If you're telling a child with ADHD to do 4 things in a row, they just can't remember the past in order to remember the future. They can't hook that information. And the same with what they see. They can't remember the past in order to see themselves in the future. I'll come back to that in a minute. But of course the working memory then links to the long-term memory. Okay. Should we make this more complicated? No, let's leave it there for a minute. So all I want you to know now is that what we see and what we hear is not being integrated into the memory. And we'll come back to this in a minute. So children with hyperactivity, if we look at the top, they're fidgeting, they're not staying in their seat, they're not sitting on the carpet listening to you read them a story, they're squirming, they're running around, they're climbing, they are always talking. And usually very loudly, and it doesn't matter how many times you say, could you use your inside voice? They're still talking really loudly. Now by the time we get to adolescence, this is internalizing. This hyperactivity is internalizing. They are feeling restless. They have a bit of low self-esteem. They are constantly busy doing different things. This might be reading several books at once, having several projects on the go, planning something whilst doing something else. They never stop doing things. But not like a young child. They're not climbing all over the furniture. They're not running around the room, but their mind is constantly busy. If somebody walks past that door, they're going, oh, what are they doing? Yeah? They're constantly thinking about the next thing. They are not on task. Discipline problems, and they are beginning to take high risk behaviours. High-risk behaviours is one of the issues with adolescence and adulthood, particularly ADHD. A disorder of time. They don't stop and think about the future. They haven't learned from the past in order to know what the goal is in the future. They have no self-regulation. So they are driving fast. They are doing the sex, the drugs, and the rock and roll. They don't stop and think. And when we come on to here, and I'll talk about this in a moment, they don't have inner speech. They don't have that voice that says, is that a good idea? Should I be driving 100 kilometres an hour down the road? They don't have that inner voice. They cannot learn from the past to think about how that behaviour influences the future. Future. So they don't learn from the police stopping them to know that that is going to happen again in the future. There is no self-regulation. There is no thought for what will happen in the future. Impulsivity in preschool. They are extremely excitable. The highest of highs. Everything is wonderful. Everything is exciting. And because of this, sometimes their motor abilities don't catch up with what they are doing. They have fine and gross motor difficulties. They are sometimes awkward and sometimes clumsy. And when we look at the brain in a minute, we will look at the cerebellum at the back. They are fearless. Self-regulation. They're not thinking about the future. They are not learning from the past in order to think about their goal-directed behaviour. They have low frustrations and tolerance of others, and this leads to peer problems. They don't keep friends, they don't hold friends, and by the time we get into adulthood, a lot of individuals with ADHD have lost their core friendship group. Friends forgive a lot, but they don't forgive everything. So by the time we get to elementary school, by the time we get to primary school and on to secondary school, this social immaturity, this prefrontal cortex, this working 30% behind other typically developing children is really quite obvious. They are having frequent arguments with others. They are doing socially unacceptable behaviours. No self-regulation. They are not stopping to think about their actions and how it affects other people. They have no inner voice. They always want to be the centre of attention. They answer questions before the speaker has finished. They're impulsive. Whatever they think about is whatever they say. They are always interrupting others, and of course this is influencing their peer relationships. By the time we get to adolescence, they have very poor relationships, they have very low self-esteem, they have discipline problems, particularly if we haven't picked up the ODD, the oppositional defiant disorder. They are continuing to argue with other people. They're impulsive. You annoy them, they will let you know. They don't stop and think. They don't learn from their past. Risk-taking behaviours are increasing. They are the ones who are experimenting. And of course, their brain is acting 30% behind other typically developing children. So they are taking bigger risks. And this comes, a lot of it, down to dopamine. typically developing individuals will have that shot of dopamine, that reward, that pleasure. These individuals are not getting that. So they are taking bigger risks. Yeah? They need to live a little. We would play a computer game and we'd think, yes, that was exciting, I got my shot of dopamine. We'd watch Netflix. That was brilliant, makes us feel good. They have that dopamine, that reward, that pleasure. They need to do things in order to get that reward, to get that pleasure. So that is the sex, that is the drugs, and that is the driving fast. And of course, when we're looking at adulthood, this risk-taking behaviour, they spend money, they drive fast, unprotected sex, yeah, it all leads on. Okay, so back to self-regulation. We'll come back to this. ADHD is a disorder of self-regulation. Self-control towards that future goal. They do not have that cognitive control that you or I would have. And what that all means is that any action that an individual directs at themselves can result in changing our behaviour from something that we would have done to something else. That voice on our shoulder changes our behaviour, so we're not impulsive, we stop, we think, we change the future consequence. Okay, and that changes our goal. If I go into a coffee shop and I am on a diet, I've got a big race coming up, I do not want to eat that beautiful, squishy, squashy, gooey, creamy, chocolatey donut. I have that inner voice that says, Lexi, buy your coffee, get out. You don't want it, it's going to interfere with your training, you're going to put on weight, come on, you've done really well. I can go up to the counter, I have my self-regulation, I can change that behaviour, I can grab my coffee and I can leave. I have regulated my behaviour. That is not something you learn. Self-regulation we are born with. We all have this working memory. We have this inner voice, this inner speech. Children with ADHD don't. So when we look at executive functioning and we're looking at cognitive control, self-awareness, there's an issue, a dilemma, a problem. I want that cake and I want it now. I have motivation for my long-term goals. I have self-control. That's going to interfere with my diet plan for my race. I don't want it. I have that long-term goal. These guys don't. I can see my past. I can see my training. I know how much work I've put in. So I can see the future. I can see that finish line. These kids cannot relate these together. They have that inner voice, they have that visual imagery, and that problem-solving ability. They turn, or I'm in the coffee shop, I turn around. I don't see the cakes. I don't look at them. I walk away. That is my self-directed play, my problem-solving behaviour. Is that all beginning to make a bit more sense? Possibly. Oh, it's all coming out at one thing. Woo! Now I've lost it. Okay. So executive function is a set of mental skills that help us get things done. That's self-regulation, that cognitive control. And it's all controlled by our frontal lobe. It is to do with our working memory. It is to do with our language, our verbal fluency, our inner voice. It is a motor response, our motor coordination. and it is emotional. And a lot of this is to do with self-regulation of emotion. Right. There was a lovely Russell Barkley who does a lot of work with ADHD children, and he's going to talk to you about self. And if you Google him, he does an awful lot of videos on YouTube that are well worth watching.
The latest thinking on AD.
Just stop. It's like there's something living in my computer. Okay, so as he said, a disorder of self-regulation, disorder of time, a disorder of regulating our emotions, all for that future goal. Friends forgive a lot. They forgive you when you are excited and you're hyperactive and you're jumping around. They forgive you when you don't turn up to coffee because you've been distracted by something else. They forgive you when you forget their birthdays. However, friends do not forgive the anger, the hostility, and the raw emotion. So when we're talking about ADHD, we are just talking about a disorder of emotion. And this is a major issue when it gets to adolescence and adulthood. The marital breakups, the friends breakdown, the road rage, the risk-taking. It's all the anger. And a lot of that comes down to conduct disorder. They don't regulate their own anger. They take risks. They don't listen to authority. And it all falls apart. We get low self-esteem, and we get depression, and we get suicide in the worst cases. And this leads to very strong social, emotional, and physical and academic difficulties. Now, we talked last week about in the DSM, when does something become a disorder, and that is when symptoms impact on your life. ADHD causes significant destruction, not to your own life, but to your friends and to your family as well. The earlier we can get an understanding of your particular issues, and we'll come on to diagnosis in a minute, the better the case may be. We can have behavioural modifications and we can have medication. There is a major impact on academic performance if we do not have those teachers and the parents being that behavioural reward. Remembering that these children don't have dopamine. We need to be their dopamine. So the earlier we can get that happening, the better the outcomes. Now, there's some brilliant research that went on last year looking at driving risk-taking behaviour it was 60 teenagers who had ADHD and conduct disorder. What is the leading death of adolescents in the USA? Motor vehicle accidents. And if we are giving keys to adolescents who are risk-taking, they're driving fast, they don't wear seat belts, they can crash, we are talking a major impact on them. Okay? Remembering that these children, their prefrontal cortex is just not in control as typically developing children would be. So they have a huge risk impact on their driving, and this leads to a lot of deaths in children who have ADHD and are allowed keys to the car. If you have a kid with ADHD, do not give them car keys until they're at least mid-20s. There is also some interesting research again done last year looking at preschool children the structure of their brains when you have ADHD, and seeing if we can now predict, it's a longitudinal study, can predict those preschoolers who will go on to have adolescent and adulthood ADHD. But of course we're not going to know those results for a while. So there is a lot of research that is going on to help us understand the long-term impact. And of course the more advanced we get with technology, the more we can see that fMRIs or the MRIs, the structure, what is happening in the brain. Why do 50% continue to have ADHD in adulthood? Why do others not? Okay, we don't know that. You guys can find that out. Yeah, go and do some research, go and collect some data, go and get a grant. Yeah, we need people like you to come in and sort this out. So there is a lot of wonderful research going on. We still do not understand enough about ADHD. Let's just do 5 more minutes, not even that, and then let's have a break. Okay, so clinical features. We know that from the get-go, these children have far more difficulties than typically developing children. These are the children that have eating disorders, particularly bulimia nervosa. They have sleeping problems, they have negative temperament. Do you remember Cross and Thomas, who did the 3 types of temperament? Easy, slow to warm up, and difficult. These are the ones who have the difficult temperaments. And these children have greater emotional responses, and of course that leads on to conduct disorder. Now you do know that oppositional defiant disorder, if not treated, goes on to conduct disorders. Do you know that? So children who have oppositional defiant disorder in childhood, if that is not looked after and identified early, that anger, that hostility can lead to, or does lead to, conduct disorder in adulthood. And that is when they cheat and they lie, and it is really quite severe. So childhood onset ODD can lead to conduct disorder later on. So by the time we are seeing school age, we are seeing more of this oppositional behaviour, this aggression, this non-compliance, and this risk-taking, these dangerous behaviours. By the time we get to late adolescence, we're seeing a decline, often in the severity, particularly in hyperactivity, because that is being internalised. And of course, one of the biggest predictors of teenage pregnancy is female ADHD. Okay, they take the risks, they have the drinking, they have the drugs, they have the unprotected sex. Okay, let's look at diagnoses. Now, as I said, we can't do brain imaging yet. We can't use an fMRI to find the bits of the brain to say whether somebody has ADHD or not. There are quite a few different rating scales we can use. The most common around the world is Conners, which asks parents and teachers to rate behaviours. There's also the ADHD rating scale or the behaviour rating form. But what's really important is to have an idea when you're doing this of the settings in which this child is displaying this behaviour, at home, at school, and how long these symptoms have been persisting for. So I don't know how well this comes out. So the Conners rating scale, it's not very long, it's very easy to administer. You get your observations, and you get not at all, a little, pretty much, and very much, and pretty much anybody can complete this. not rocket science, okay? And some of the questions are very obvious, and you can see whether they're relating to conduct disorder, whether they are relating to hyperactivity, impulsivity. So sits and fiddles with objects, hums and makes noises, fall apart under stress, coordination problems, restless, overactive, excitable, inattentive, etc., etc. And that is one of the gold standards around the world for assessing ADHD. We can also look at the Vanderbilt ADHD Diagnostic Teacher Rating Scale. Again, very simple for teachers to administer. It doesn't take up a lot of their time. Frequency, never, occasionally, often, and very often. And again, very simple understanding of behaviour. Now, I think Alma uses the SWAN, which is the, I can never remember, strengths and weaknesses of ADHD symptoms and normal behaviours. So if you do her course, you'll be looking at the SWAN. Again, I'm sure it is very similar, but obviously that's the one that she uses within Hong Kong. I've never used the SWAN. So if we're looking at the DSM-5, it's a disorder because it's persistent pattern of inattention hyperactivity that interferes with day-to-day functioning. For children, you have to have 6 or more symptoms, and you have to have had them for at least 6 months. They also have to be across domains. So they can't just happen at home, and they can't just happen at school. It has to be across the board. And these symptoms aren't the result of anything else. So it's not an intellectual disability. Okay. So we have 3 presentations when we are looking at ADHD. The combined, which is all 3 core features. So they will have hyperactivity, they will have impulsivity, and they will have inattention. They will have them all for the past 6 months, and they will have at least 6 of each. We have predominantly inattentive, again 6 symptoms, and predominantly hyperactivity, impulsivity, again 6 symptoms. So if we look at the big one here, to get the presentation of inattention, you have to have at least 6 of these. And this is why that this might become a disorder in its own right. Might become sluggish cognitive tempo, because you can have this without having those. You can have inattention, sluggish cognitive tempo, without having this. So to get the combined, you need 6 on here and 6 on here. To get just hyperactivity and impulsivity, you just have 6 on there and none on there. So if we look at the combined type, we can think of Tigger. He is hyperactive, he is restless, he is disorganised, he is inattentive, and he is impulsive. This is the most common diagnosis of ADHD, the combined type. We can have Winnie the Pooh, possibly sluggish cognitive tempo. Okay, inattentive, sluggish, slow-moving, unmotivated, a daydreamer. And of course that doesn't sound like ADHD, does it? So if it is very likely that if we get enough reliable and valid data, that this might turn into that sluggish cognitive tempo. Or they might call it something else that's slightly nicer than sluggish cognitive tempo. And then of course we get A and B. So Rabbit, he's over-focused, he's obsessive, and he's argumentative, and he's predominantly hyperactive and impulsive. Now when we're looking at ADHD, particularly these forms, they are 11 times more likely to have the conduct disorder and the hyperactivity and impulse than they are in typically developing in children. We can have mild, so they have literally the 6 symptoms. We have moderate, where they're having a few more, some more severe presentations on 1 or more, or severe. And these are in excess of those required to make the diagnoses. Now, the DSM does note that although motor symptoms of hyperactivity are less obvious in adolescence and adulthood difficulties, they persist with restlessness, inattention, poor planning, and impulsivity. So the DSM-5 does understand the concept that the hyperactivity is less frequent and internalized in adulthood. So it'll be interesting to see how that does change with the data that we are collecting at the moment. So you can see in preschool we are having, all of them are there. They might not be quite as pervasive in their presentation. By the time we're getting to childhood, we are seeing a lot more of the unfinished projects, a lot of issues with academic work. We are seeing more self-esteem issues, more depression issues, more conduct disorder issues. And then by the time we are in adolescence, we are seeing that children who are not being rewarded for their behaviour are not focusing. And this is where we really start to need an understanding of that dopamine. We are needing the medication, the behaviour, the rewards. These children can go and play video games for hours because they are being rewarded. They have something to do. They're risk-taking in all that they are doing. You get them to do homework, there is no reward there. And when we talk about behavioural interventions, we are talking about the stickers, the bribery, the payment method, whatever it is that you need to do to get them through to do their homework. Because they can do it when they're being rewarded for computer games, but they can't do it themselves for other things because there is no reward there. They can't stay focused. So there's a few factors why we see more children with ADHD now than we have done in the past. This is because in 2000 they changed the way in which we see the diagnosis. Instead of lumping them all together, we see the different presentations. And again, the level of number of children being diagnosed might change as we see the DSM 5.1 whenever that comes out. The reliability of being able to diagnose it makes a difference. We know what we are actually looking at in the 3 different presentations. Parents are more aware of it. They have an understanding of it. And sometimes they need that label to get the funding, to get the medication and the interventions from school, the shadow teachers, and everything that goes with having a diagnosis of ADHD. And because of the increase in number of children having ADHD, the medical world's gone, great, we can get some money out of this, and they've done a lot of research, and there have been an amazing development on the number of drugs that are available for children with ADHD. It's not just Ritalin anymore, there are numerous types of drugs, and we will show you those in a minute. So this is going to work if I do that. Oh man.
With ADHD, the problem is that you sort of
I'm going to try to rephrase this because I'm sort of going on a tangent.
What just happened? What was I saying? I misbehaved a lot as a kid, but I didn't mean to.
The natural environment of a classroom is very non-conducive to somebody with ADHD. You know, just like this quiet room, you're sitting at this table, a bunch of other kids are all doing their work. It was almost like it's sensory overload. Like everything is coming at you all at once.
I would be trying to focus on this teacher, and then all of a sudden I would like snap to it again, and I had missed half of what the teacher had talked about. I was like, you're high or something. Like, it's kind of similar to being high.
One of the side effects of ADHD is a sort of an inability, or at least a tough time staying still, concentrating, focusing on day-to-day tasks.
I feel like my thoughts are sort of on like a carousel in my brain, and it's going in circles, and each thought stops for like 2 seconds in front of my eyes. I can barely grasp it, and then it's gone.
The third day I was at BuzzFeed, I was taking some like safety test with my friend, fellow producer here, Caitlin, and I'm like already lost on like the packet. I look over and like Caitlin answered like the first 10 questions already. And it's just that that's like the story of my life is like looking over to my friend and being like, how the hell did you just do that?
I have been on some form of medication ever since I was 13.
I stopped taking medication for me because I just didn't like the way it made me feel. They curbed my appetite, I was losing weight.
But the medication provides me with clarity.
When I'm not on my medicine, it feels like the smallest tasks are really overwhelming because I can't visualize and focus on the simple process.
I have to plan things out, I have to write everything down, or else I forget. I don't advocate that everyone go off their meds if they don't need to. For me, that was something that I felt I wanted to do.
It looks different in everybody. I would just wish people were a little more sensitive with like the verbal assumptions they make.
I just wish people believed it was real. My ADHD is like the realest thing in my life. Like I can't reach out and touch it, but I can feel it.
Okay, so we talked there about the DSM and then the reality, how it actually impacts people's lives in that video. Has anybody been touched by ADHD? Does that resonate with anybody, whether it's yourself or some family member or somebody you've worked with? Does anybody have a story that they want to share?
With my friend, he has ADHD, and then it's really hard to like be friends with him because like he speaks really loud, and he doesn't really care about like how people think about him. Like when we are like sitting really quietly, like he doesn't have like talking, like he just talk like constantly, and he also like have road rage as well. Like he drives really fast, and he hit a car. Like he had like 2 car accidents like within a year, and he think like it's not his fault, like it's about like the other person.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like, I think the interesting thing is like when you talk about like they might have like low self-esteem, but like I don't see that in him. Like he's like really handsome, like he looks good, and he makes a lot of friends. He doesn't know like he doesn't have friends. Like when friends are around him, he doesn't know like we don't like him at all. He's like, oh, I have a lot of friends. Like he doesn't see that.
That's good for him.
Yeah.
Not so much for you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
One of my students got ADHD in my class, and he always argued with somebody. Just maybe he saw somebody laugh, and then he say maybe they laugh at me. So he just scream, and sometimes when he heard some exciting music, he will get mad, and then suddenly he just, I'm so angry, I cannot control myself.
And how old is he?
6 years old. And actually, that is a great problem in my class because something people don't want to play with him. And then because they say, oh, this child, I don't want to play with him because he's always angry, he always shouts at me. And so he is lonely sometimes. And maybe he just express his feeling in a moment. And then when you say you love him, he's so happy. And one time I just shout at him. I don't want it, but I'm so angry at the time. And shout, and then I say, okay, I come down and I say, oh, I'm very sad because I don't have my recess also. I have talk with you. And then at lunch, he give me a small piece of cake and say, oh, so I'm so sorry that you don't have recess time. So
difficult.
The kids, they don't understand, and some parents also don't understand.
Yeah.
So I hope that when the teachers can just learn more about ADHD, so that they can teach them well, and then that
It's exhausting.
Yeah.
It is exhausting
Yeah,
to
yeah.
tolerate that behaviour. How long have you been friends with your friend for?
For like a year and
Oh, is that all?
two. Yeah, but like I stopped being friends. Yeah. Yeah.
And in there lies the problem.
It's really hard to be friends.
It is. It is incredibly difficult. Anybody else?
I have students. I will organize a class with many SEN students. Some of them are ADHD. They will synchronize each other. For example, if one children with ADHD, they move forward and backward, and the other will easily move like that. And the child, he said, when he's nervous because I'm teaching and he has to stay still, sit still, and he will bite his t-shirt, and bite his t-shirt and she told me every t-shirt in his home was having bites or get wet because he wants to control. It's difficult for him, I know. So I'll tolerate his behavior when I.
How flexible? You're just saying that the child with how old is he?
8 years old.
8 years old chews on his t-shirt when he's trying to
During the lesson, yeah.
concentrate. How flexible is your school for allowing?
Oh yeah, very flexible because it's a center, not a school.
Okay.
It's a center just for SEN students.
So is he allowed a wiggle cushion or time
Yes,
out?
sometimes I give a flip board for him to sit,
Yeah.
just like that and listen to my classes.
And do you feel that helps or?
And a little bit help because he just moving and he can concentrate a bit. But if there are 2 or 3 students with ADHD, they will influence each other. Very, very difficult. But it's also a good dynamic because when I ask one student to behave well, and the other 2 may have a little bit influence. But it's hard for them because they are impulsive from the inside. They really want to concentrate.
Yeah.
They just do anything, bite the fingers.
They
bite
want
the t-shirt.
to concentrate
Yeah.
so
Yes,
much they
so
want to fit
we
in.
won't,
Yeah.
mind them.
It is not a problem with knowledge. You know, they have that knowledge. They just can't well, it's not processing disorder at all. It's putting it into action disorder. Yeah. It's like they always say, if you have somebody in a wheelchair and they come into the building and they use the ramp on Monday, and they come into the building on Tuesday and they use the ramp, and they're in a wheelchair on the Wednesday and they come into the building and they use the ramp. On the Thursday, they still need to use that ramp. They're not going to get up and walk. On the Friday, they're going to use the ramp. They can't get up and walk. And it's the same with ADHD. You can't expect a child with ADHD to suddenly snap out of it. It is a brain-based disorder. That child has problems, and we are the ones that need to deal with that. We need to be their ramp and allow them into the building. We need to be their behavioural modification. We need to be their dopamine. They're not going to change. Yeah. And until we know why children, you know, the hyperactivity goes and the ADHD goes in adolescence, you know, we're not going to know how to deal with that. So we need to be their brain connections so that that knowledge and that ability is integrated. So getting a diagnosis is absolutely paramount, but you've got to remember that even though you might see a child who has hyperactivity, who has impulsivity, they have to have these symptoms across the board and for 6 months in order to get the diagnosis of ADHD. It can quite possibly be several other disorders. So you now as clinicians, as researchers, those of you who want to go on to do clinical psych or ed psych, understand the diagnosis criteria. And it is very important that they get a professional diagnosis, not their mum, not their friend. Yeah, they need to actually have a proper clinical diagnosis. Because there are a lot of other issues with children who have ADHD As I said before, 80% of them will have some other diagnosis as well. Some children also have bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, they have the highest of highs. When they go shopping, my God, they go shopping for 3 days and they max out their credit cards. And then they go to bed and they are depressed and they can't actually function for the next however many months it is. They can have this and ADHD. They can have Tourette syndrome, tic syndrome, motor syndrome. It is a neurological disorder, verbal tics or nervous tics. They can blink their eyes or shrug their shoulders or whatever it is. That is quite common with ADHD, and also specific learning disabilities, one of the most common comorbid conditions with ADHD. We can also, as you know, almost half the children can also have oppositional defiant disorder. They are non-compliant, they are belligerent, they are stubborn, they are aggressive, and if you don't catch that early, it turns into conduct disorder, and my word, that is awful. It is destructive. They are at risk of getting into trouble with school, in trouble with police, they lie, they steal. It is a very difficult disorder to deal with and to live with. And of course, what comes with that is the anxiety and the depression. So there's a lot of accompanying disorders with ADHD. Okay, causes, I think we've touched on this already. It is biological, it is not social. Twin studies have shown us a lot of information, and this is almost out of date now. We need to start thinking with females, it is almost all genetic. With males, 80% of it is genetic. The other 30% is acquired. It is exacerbated in pregnancy if you smoke, if you drink alcohol, if you are born prematurely, if your mother has any issues with viruses or bacterial infections, it will make the ADHD worse. Diet as well has an influence, a correlation, a relationship, but it does not cause it. We know it is biological, and then that plays an important role in the manifestation of the condition, and we know that the environmental factors just create its severity. We also know that because parents have ADHD as well, and they are not rewarding, they are not being the dopamine, they are not helping the child, that can make the ADHD worse. Now we know also that environment plays a role in video games. They play more, they tweet more, they watch more TV. It's a function of it. Computer games do not cause ADHD. Food additives don't cause ADHD. And actually we do know now that fish oils do not help children with ADHD. There was a massive thing years ago that it did. It does not. We're now going to look at brain behaviour. See if this works. Okay, so we do know a lot more about the drugs and the neurotransmitters than when that video was made, and we do know an awful lot more about the genetics behind dopamine, and we'll come back to that in a second. We know that it is the prefrontal cortex, sometimes predominantly on the right side, and that allows us to organise our behaviour. If you remember your brain, our prefrontal cortex is our working memory, it is our attention, it is our personality, it's how we make decisions. And we know that the prefrontal cortex isn't developed properly until our mid-20s. And so children who are functioning 30% behind that, the risk-taking behaviours, the attention, the working memory. We know that the basal ganglia has issues, and that is just below the limbic system, which is in the middle of our brain. And the limbic system is to do with our emotions. So prefrontal cortex, disorder of executive functioning, cognitive control, self-regulation. And then when we're looking at the basal ganglia, disorder of emotion. So we can see the different areas of the brain. We also know motor cortex, again, is in our frontal lobe, and cerebellum, which is at the back, and that does a lot of our executive functioning as well. We are learning that our cerebellum has a lot to do with our executive functioning, not just the prefrontal cortex. Our cerebellum also has to do with our motor control, our fine motor movements, our gross motor skills as well. Like I said last week, if you have alcohol and you lose your balance, it's because you've affected your cerebellum. The anterior cingulate, we are learning a lot more about this, and again, this has implications in executive functioning, problem solving, time, emotions, motivation. So we can now see where this is coming from and why it is a brain-based disorder. And again, our PFC, our prefrontal cortex, our planning, our behaviour, our personality, our decision making, those social skills. And if we look at fMRIs, functions of the brain, we can see, in control subjects and ADHD subjects where this is happening. Now, we can't diagnose, but we can see, and as we get more and more advanced in our technology, we can see different areas of the brain are activated differently, and the responses between control subjects and ADHD subjects. Right, on to dopamine. Now, do you remember in your undergraduate, the way in which we process information around our brain is through action potentials, that electrical impulse, and the chemical reactions to communicate, which is all to do with neurotransmitters. And only certain neurotransmitters will connect to receptor cells, like a key in a lock. We now know that it's not that these children don't have enough dopamine, it's that it's being vacuumed up too quickly. So it's not reaching the areas of the brain that it needs to reach. Very much like our serotonin reuptake inhibitors work to help with depression. We need Ritalin, for example, to be like the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It plugs the hole for the hoovers, if you like, in our brain, the receptor cells. And we know that dopamine plays a large role in that rewards and the pleasures, and turns to norepinephrine, which is linked also to depression. Low levels of norepinephrine. So it's all about those pleasure-seeking behaviours, so they can play computer games, they can get rewarded for it, but they can't do their homework because they're not getting any dopamine, they're not getting any rewards in the brain. So it is those receptor cells, they're not efficient as typically developing individuals. And therefore we need to regulate the levels of dopamine in the brain. Now, low levels of norepinephrine are linked to depression, are linked to pain. So we also need to consider that. Often linked to anxiety and inattention, concentration. The twin studies, we can see in good control studies going back quite a long way that the relationship is genetic, and we know now, if we can see, it is highly inheritable, and this is all to do with the genes related to dopamine. And this is around the world, it doesn't matter where in the world, we know that it is to do with the genes related to these neurotransmitters. And you can read all about the genetics. And if we look at the molecular genetics, we know that the two dopamine gene, the DAT1 and the DRD4, have been reported to be associated with ADHD. And this is an amazing achievement, because if we can see where the genes lie, we can see how much of the environment, the acquired ADHD in boys, and where that comes from. And then we can tease apart how we do treatments and therapies for the different types and severities of ADHD. So both Ritalin and Concerta and some of the other medicines that we will look at all work as dopamine reuptake inhibitors, so that they allow the secretion of dopamine around our heads, our brains. So internationally, 3 to 7 per 100 school children. We know that males are affected more than females. We've said that, haven't we? In Hong Kong, the prevalence is about 6.1. More recently, we don't have a lot of the figures actually for Hong Kong. When we include females as well, I don't think we can be particularly reliable or particularly accurate with how common it is here, but we do know that the prevalence and the genetics, and the more we understand it, we will get far more reliable and valid data. Right, let's get you doing something fun. If you've got laptops, you can go to understood.org and go through your child's eyes. If you're on a phone, you can have a look at that. And I'll keep that up there because I want to show you how we are going to have a bit of fun. Okay, so if you go onto the Through Your Child Eyes website, or understood.org, it looks a bit like that. And you can get to Through Your Child's Eyes. And if you've got headphones, it might be quite a useful idea. I want you to go to the attention issues. You can do this yourselves.
Okay, put away your books.
And it's an example
of
what it feels like to have ADHD.
For the animals. Listen to me carefully. In front of you are some animal cards and a grid.
So if you've got a computer, you can do it
yourselves.
yourselves.
Each animal card,
Or you
so
can do it
every animal ends up in the right place on the grid. Are you ready? Everyone take the snake card. Now look at the grid. Put the snake card on the camel in the grid. Got it? Good. Now take the bird card and put it on the kangaroo in the grid. Dylan, are you with us? Okay. Now take the monkey. Put it on the floor. I don't have a monkey. Is that yours on the floor? Now find the kangaroo card.
Oh,
Emma and Maddie, pay attention. Dylan, are you with us? Okay now everyone, look at the octopus.
Ew, weird.
Your grid. Now look for the elephant. Jacob and Sophia, please stop. Put the elephant on the board. I want you to place the rhino on top of it.
Dino. I saw rhinoceros at the zoo when I went with my mom.
Put the monkey on the Jaden, don't interrupt.
I don't have any animals left. Miss Saldano, my game is missing a piece.
Ready?
Shark
now
on the
flip your
what?
cards over. What do you see?
Okay, so if you want to have a go at that, you can have a go at that in your own time. But it's just an idea of the amount of input that these children are having and what they are paying attention to and what they are not paying attention to. And actually it's a really good website to have a play with. Okay, so treatment of ADHD. Medicines, behaviours, and home and classroom management. Now, I'm not an educational psychologist, but I will give you a few tips and a few good websites to have a look if this is something that you need with your class. Okay, each and every child is different. Even in twins, some medication will work for some children, others will be better for different presentations. Some children work well with behaviour management, some children don't. Now, when we look at medications, we have stimulants, and more recently we have non-stimulants as well. We are talking about Ritalin, Adderall, Concerta, Ritalin, Vivancy. Vivancy is one of the newest. They seem to be the most effective, and all of them are considered safe to use. They do not make the children feel high, and there's no evidence that it will continue to drug abuse or other types of abuse of other drugs or dependency of other drugs. However, the drugs themselves can cause issues. In many people, the stimulants reduce the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, and improve their focus. And this works in about 90% of children. The stimulants work in about 90% of children. In 10%, they just don't work. And more recently, we've got non-stimulant medication, atomoxetine or striata, which is wonderful if the stimulants don't work. However, stimulants work fast. They have been around for a long time, but they do have a lot of side effects. The advantages of the non-stimulants is that they don't have as many side effects, but they take 2 to 3 weeks to kick in. They also only work in about 50% of children. So it will depend on what works for you. They are not a cure. They're never going to cure it, but they will help focus. They will help with that future goal. They will help with your cognitive concentration. They all work to increase the level of dopamine and norepinephrine that is secreted around the brain. So we are looking at dopamine, the rewards, the pleasures. We are looking at the norepinephrine, which is to do with our attention and memory, and these two are very closely related. Epinephrine to do with stress and long-term memory. The serotonin, the depression, feeling happy, and partly to do with the histamines, decreased stress. I think I've said all of that. Works in about 80% of people. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of prescriptions that are being written for ADHD medication. Dopamine, serotonin, histamine, we've said all of that, just if you want to read it. Okay, there are pellets, there are pills, and there are patches, and it depends on your personal interest and what works for you, depending on how you want it released. Adderall can come in different forms. The patch, which is really good, Daytrana, for those children who don't like taking pills. And we have new ones now, Vivancy, which goes straight into the stomach rather than, you're less likely to abuse it basically because it does what it needs to do on the absorption within your stomach rather than a fast release. So most of you will have heard of Adderall and Ritalin and Concerta. You can definitely get Ritalin and Concerta here in Hong Kong. Adderall, I think, is under a different name, and whether you're allowed to buy it here, I don't know. You can probably buy it over the counter in one of the dodgy places. But I don't know about Adderall. They all work by blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine and dopamine. They all work to improve attention and impulse control. And studies say that you have to be on it for a certain number of time for it to have the full effect. Now, if we look at Adderall first, and it was given the name because it's Attention Deficit Disorder for all. Adderall. It is an amazing drug. It is one of the go-to solutions for adult ADHD, but it does have a lot of side effects. And the side effects are euphoria. They give you better sexual pleasure. It gives you better physical performance, and it gives you better concentration. Now, they don't seem to be particularly bad side effects, which is why it is so abused in the United States. A lot of college kids will take Adderall and they will buy other people's prescriptions for it, which is why I think predominantly you are not really able to get it here. Ritalin, one of the most used drugs for actual ADHD. It was named after the scientist's wife, who was called Rita. And originally, he actually made the drug because of depression. So his wife had depression, and he realised that one of the side effects was to reduce hyperactivity. So it was actually used for hyperactivity, although he made it for his wife. So methylamphetamidate has been around for a very long time. Again, it works by slowing down the reuptake of dopamine and letting it go to all areas of the brain. It works by helping you focus. Now, Ritalin is fast action, it is fast onset, but it doesn't last very long. So if you've got children in your class who are on Ritalin, they'll have to take it in the morning, they'll have to take it probably at lunchtime, and if they're staying for an extracurricular activity, they also need to take it after school to get them through. So that is one of the downsides of Ritalin. The other downside of Ritalin is if you take it with alcohol, it causes some major problems. Major problems. So we have Concerta. Now, Concerta is brilliant. You can get it here. It does cost a lot of money, but it is a mixture of the Ritalin, which is fast acting, and then a compound. It's actually a pellet, which has sustained release. So these children can just take one tablet now, and it will last them the whole day. It can last up to 12 hours. So they don't have to keep taking that medication at school, which is really good. If you are interested, and I'll show you the trailer for it now, there is a very interesting Netflix. I think you can probably get it in other places as well. It's all I can get on my VPN these days. I don't have PCCW come into my world. Can't cope with them. all about taking your pills, and well, let's watch the clip. Much better than listening to me talk. Well worth watching. It's one of those shows you think, oh, I've got to take Adderall, this is going to solve everything. And then you get to the end and think, oh my word, I'm never taking any medication again. It is real fascinating insight into the positive side of Adderall, the addictive side of Adderall, and the horrific side of effects that it can lead to and totally mess up your brain when you don't have ADHD. Okay, so it is an interesting show to watch. Do watch it if you are interested in the medicines and how it can affect your brain. So what does the research show us? The research shows us that medicine works in 90% of individuals. Stimulants are brilliant. They keep you focused. If you are on non-stimulants, it will work in about 50% of the time, but they don't have so many side effects, but only work in 50% of, for 50% of individuals. We also know that ADHD treatment studies to date found that long-term management with medication and the combination of medication and behavioural treatment is the way forward. Now we can see cognitive behavioural therapy works very well for adults. We can also see that mindfulness is really coming into children and adults with ADHD. And if anybody does expressive psychotherapies, we will look into mindfulness in ADHD and autism, and possibly for the DLN lot in the last semester as well. It is definitely an interesting area if you are interested in treatments, the new mindfulness. So we need to think about the psychotherapies, the behavioural therapies, the social skills training, the support groups, parent skills, parent training, as well as the medication. Now, bearing in mind, those of you who are thinking about going into parent training and teaching parents, loads of them are going to have ADHD themselves, which throws up a whole different ballgame when you're trying to teach parents that they are the dopamine, that they have to do the rewards, and they have to keep their child on track. So there is no magic solution for parents. Basically, parents have to come to terms with the fact that their child is functioning 30% behind, or 4 or 5 years behind. So when other children are going off to do babysitting, your child can't. They are not allowed, should not be anywhere near looking after a baby. Other children are getting their driving licenses. Your child can't. You do not give that child keys to the car. We know their risk-taking behaviour. We know that they will be driving too fast, that they will be not wearing seat belts, that they will be doing really silly things. You do not give your child the keys to your car for another 4 years. So there is an awful lot that parents need to come to terms with. They need to accept the condition. They need to come to terms that it's going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging, and they need to change the way in which they parent. They also need to know that the child is a valued member of their family. They have to be loved, because these children do have very much social and emotional problems. They will have academic difficulties that they need far more support than their typically developing counterpart. So when we're looking at behavioural therapy, you need to be their working memory, the inner voice, their past, their future. You need to be organising them, their schoolwork. You need to be their dopamine, their praise, their reward, and you do that any way which you can. You give them stickers, you give them money, you give them what they want to get things done. Other children have dopamine. You do not. You have to give them those, just like you would in a child with ASD. You are their rewards. You give them rules, you give them lists, you structure the routines, and you will help control their behaviour. You are their working memory. They can't hold information. You write it down. It all goes on sticky notes. If you're trying to organise a story for homework, they can't do the beginning, the middle and the end and hold that in their inner working memory. You write it on sticky notes and you write it down for them. Their week, their planning, their PE kit, it is all written down. They cannot hold the information. They will not remember what happened yesterday to remember what happened in the future. They forget their PE kit, they've forgotten it the next day. Okay? You are their working memory. Okay, so it comes down to behavioural modification techniques, and it comes down to drug therapy, and it's trying to find a combination that works for you, be that a pellet, a pill or a patch, be that a stimulant or a non-stimulant, whatever works. You are doing the routines, and these have to be consistent. They have to be rules that are consistent. You have to give instructions that are clear. You reward their good behaviour, and like any good parents, you don't reward the undesirable behaviour. It comes down to Pavlov and his dogs, and it comes down to operant conditioning. Those behaviours that you reward will be performed again and again. Those behaviours, the undesirable behaviours, you ignore it, they will hopefully go away. You praise the positive, you ignore the negative. You also, I'm not going to show that one. You also keep it short. If you want their attention, you touch them on the shoulder, you look them in the eye, and you say one or two things to them. You don't give them lists and lists and lists. So go upstairs to your bedroom, I want you to do this, that and the other. Or your next task at school is to write a list, and then I want you to do this, and then I want you to do that. They can't get that. If you're the teacher, you tap them on the shoulder, you look them in the eye, and you give them one or two things to do, and you write it down. Okay, I'm not going to show that. So, teachers, parents, keep a schedule, do the same thing every day. Organise. They will lose anything and everything, their PE kit, their phone, their homework. You need to almost tie it to them. A book, a pen, a pencil, where they write it down. Okay, and that is how they will remember their working memory. They will have that list of things to do. Everything needs to be organised, everything needs to be written down or tied to them. Okay, classroom management, it goes exactly the same. It is motivation. These children get frustrated easily because they have a different perception of what is going on. They have so much going on. There are people walking outside the classroom. There is noises. There is so much. Even if they're using felt tip pens, the smell of the felt tip pen when they take off the lid, they're like, ooh, and off they go into a different world. Okay? Everything changes their perception of what they are doing. If there is a lack of structure in the classroom, they do not know what they are supposed to be doing. Very much like ABA therapy. They need almost those stickers to say, this is what you're doing now, this is what you're doing next. They act the role of being bad because they get attention and they thrive off the attention. They are the class clown. They don't know how to ask to get what they need, so they act out. Yeah, they don't use their words. A lot of these children, remember, conduct disorder, ODD, they have specific learning disabilities. The classroom's full of distractions, so keep their desk in front of you clear of as many distractions as you can. Remember, this child feels misunderstood. Nobody listens to them. Nobody understands them. Yeah? Just talk to them. Do you understand? Have you got that? Have you written down that list of things? Just so that they are clear in their head. Because they're not listening to you. They've switched off. They're focusing on what's happening down the corridor. Overwhelmed. Every time you give them worksheets, every time you tell them what to do, overwhelmed, one thing at a time. And because they've drifted off and they're not paying attention, and because you're giving them specific one-on-one, they feel like they are totally being criticised. They feel overwhelmed. They feel like they're underachieving. Okay, so there's a lot of social and emotional issues that are happening at the same time. So these children need academic management, frequent breaks from learning. To tell a child with ADHD he's got an extra half an hour in an exam is ridiculous. They can't sit still for 5 minutes. You're telling them they've got an extra half an hour? It's not going to work. They need frequent breaks. They can have an extra half an hour, not all at the same time. Give them 10 minutes. They can go out. They can come back in, do another 10 minutes. Okay, making them sit there for an extra amount of time is not helping. They're not hearing you. They can't hold instructions. Write them down. Break tasks into smaller steps. Reduce the noise level. And if you can, rearrange the seating so that they are in front of you. They're not at the back where they can see everybody else as a distraction. Okay, they're in front of you. And hopefully, if we do all of that, we will give them a little chance that they need to be the person that they can be. Now, if we've got time at the end, I'll show you managing classroom ADHD. If not, you can watch that video yourself. I just want to do something with you before we get there. So as I said, if symptoms persist into adulthood, it usually is about 50% from childhood to adolescence, and from adolescence, this is the wrong way around, isn't it? Children to adolescence, 80%, and then 65% into adulthood. Now, we need to understand this a little bit more. I don't think we particularly understand why some children's ADHD persists into adulthood, but we know that those who have more severe and more number of symptoms will persist into adulthood. Types of symptoms exhibited, severity and number, individual's intelligence. That is quite an interesting one, I think. The higher the IQ, and that probably relates to creativity and all sorts of other things that we will come on to. Family situation, the more help they're getting, the more reward, the more things are written down, the more structure, the more support, the more social and emotional support that they get, the medication that they receive will all help. Alma will do more on treatments in Hong Kong. I'm obviously not a clinical psych here, but there is a lot of combination of medical and psychotherapy, parent managing, classroom management, impulse control, understanding executive functioning. Within Hong Kong, Ritalin is definitely the first line treatment, and Concerta as well. The other drugs, they're still being observed in the US. Whether you can get them here or not, I don't know. I've painted a very negative picture of ADHD, and that is because it is a very destructive disorder. However, these children can be creative, they can be imaginative, because they connect things that other children don't see. They constantly do things. They are thinking in a different way. They are obviously doing several things at once, and they're connecting those ideas. They are great problem solvers when they get rewarded for their behaviour to stay on task, if they are interested in something. They can be very observant. They can see a flash of somebody going past. Their peripheral vision is great, you know? Like, somebody's making a noise, somebody's rustling a paper, they hear it, they see it, they react to it. And that can lead to some brilliant creative and imaginative things. They are very flexible, they are very spontaneous. They are the people who say, right, let's go to the party, let's go out, let's do this, let's do that. Constantly on the go. And that can be really good fun. Just not all the time. And maybe with a seatbelt or a condom, okay? So just think about it. They are enthusiastic, they are interested in everything. Yeah, and that's brilliant. They are lively personalities, they are energetic, they have drive. And quite a few of them can be gifted artistically and intellectually. So there are many good things to children with ADHD. We have to love them and nurture them and get them to be the best that they can possibly be. And that is by being their dopamine, by helping them out, by writing things down, by being their working memory, by being their rewards. So it's all about consequences all of the time. And if you're a parent and teacher, this is exhausting, but don't stop, because the rewards are brilliant. They don't have the internal motivation. You need to do that for them. They are not suddenly going to recover. It is a brain-based disorder. Parents and teachers are the most important treatment plans. The token economy must run at home and at school. You are giving them stickers, you are giving them rewards. Whatever it happens to be runs at home and at school. You break things down into baby steps so they know exactly what has to be done when it has to be done. Know that this working memory does not work. It's a disorder of time, it's a disorder of self-regulation, it's a disorder of executive functioning. And the more we understand that, the more we can help them. Make things physical, they can see it, it is not held in that working memory. Right, I want you to upload some ideas to Padlet. I want you to have a discussion for the next 15, 20 minutes or so. What are the positives of having ADHD? Let's end on a high note. What should treatments include? What are the negative qualities associated with ADHD? Okay, so you might want to start on number 3 and then end on a high and think about the positives. We also, we'll leave that for another day. Okay, if you use the QR, is that working? Can you see, is it working? Should upload, or should get you to a Padlet page in which you can upload your answers. You can work in whatever groups you like. Don't get distracted. You can be as impulsive as you